Uh, okay. So, Harry, welcome everybody. My name is Jason Scorse. I'm at the director for the Center for the Blue Economy at the Middlebury Institute in Monterrey, California. And I'm here to talk about the new blue economy for the 21st century. And looking forward to some Q&A. I'll probably present for maybe 15, 20 minutes, and then we can have Q&A discussion. So moving forward here, the four key pillars as we see them are these four outlined here, right? So offshore renewable energy, I'll talk about that in a minute. It's mostly offshore wind, but not exclusively. Sustainable seafood, I'll get into here as well. And a key thing here is this isn't traditionally what you think of as sustainable seafood. Coastal adaptation, big part, and then shipping and ports as well. Now, before I move on, when I talk about blue economy, some people say the sustainable blue economy. To us, that's a redundant statement. The blue economy is the sustainable piece of the ocean and coastal economy. So if you think about it, think of the ocean and coastal economy as the big pie, and then the blue economy as a piece of that pie, a subset that is sustainable. So ocean economy, offshore oil and gas, not blue economy, because it's not sustainable, because it's both polluting and promoting climate change, right? So the blue economy is a smaller subset, but this smaller subset can grow with the right investments and policies and become much larger than the total blue ocean and coastal economy is today. The last point I'll just make here is what I'm going to be outlining here are the two goals of the blue economy, in our view, is one is to use ocean and coastal resources to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. And the second is to help coastal communities adapt to climate impacts, because we know even under the best case scenario, there's a lot of climate change that's already baked into the cake right now based on historical emissions. So on to offshore renewable energy here. So we want to transition to an offshore clean energy economy, and this is going to include bringing in existing technologies and also innovating in some realms where there's a lot of promise. And again, that this kind of red circle over the offshore oil rig, this is not the blue economy. So we are calling for a moratorium and phase out of all offshore oil and gas in the United States. It's nice that the economics are in our favor on this. I'll talk about that a little bit more. But right now, oil exploration in the offshore U.S. zones is really down because the price of oil is down. So the economics, this is one small silver lining of the pandemic. I'm not happy about the pandemic. I wish there was no pandemic. But if we're going to take a silver lining, one of the silver linings is it's really dealing a huge blow to the fossil fuel industry. And it's really slowing down offshore surveying and investment, because offshore oil is more expensive than terrestrial oil for the most part, and therefore it's just not economic. So the economics of the pandemic are helping us stop this first part, which is no new offshore oil and gas. But that's not the key point. The key point is offshore wind. So right now, the key point I want to emphasize here is that offshore wind in most of coastal United States is economic right now. And what do I mean by that? I mean that it is the lowest cost electricity generator without subsidies. So, even up until 5 years ago, 7 years ago, a lot of the renewable energy in the United States required subsidies to be cost competitive. And so it's still in the public imagination, and there are still many opponents of offshore energy and clean energy in general who still try to, use the old tired trope that, it's green energy has to be subsidized, we should let the market go. Of course, they're ignoring the fact that fossil fuel industry is also a market failure in the sense that they're not paying for the damage they do. But putting that aside, even without that, even without a carbon tax, even without making fossil fuel industries pay for their methane, for their polluted water, all those which are a different form of subsidy, economics of offshore wind is incredibly favorable. And so we're calling for massive, massive expansion of offshore wind. And there's estimates that offshore wind could produce pretty much all of the US electricity over the next coming decades. It probably won't, because there's a lot of places where solar is very cheap. There's also geothermal coming online, but the economics of offshore wind are incredibly favorable. And we expect to see in the next decade up to 30 gigawatts of offshore wind developed over the United States. There's a couple other really cool technologies. The one on the left here is tidal energy, a little mock-up of a tidal energy system. And then on the right, it's wave energy system. And so these have incredible potential. There's places in the United States where the tides, swing an incredible magnitude on a regular basis. And this can produce a huge amount of electricity. And of course, waves too. At certain parts of the country get wave energy almost completely year round. And these are incredibly clean. They're not economic right now in most places. So we're calling for much more R&D into these, because we think these could be a pretty nice part of the clean energy mix in the new blue economy. But again, right now, not economic, not really at scale where offshore wind is. So I'm going to skip here to green ports now. And this is a picture of the green port in Vancouver, British Columbia. And it is aiming to be the greenest port in the world. US ports are not that far behind. The Port of LA, Port of Long Beach, Port of San Diego, California is where you're really seeing the most green ports in the country. The reason this is important is a couple reasons. First of all, the greenhouse gas emissions from the ships, from the trucks, from all the equipment is a huge source of greenhouse gases. Also, many of you might not know, but the shipping industry is the dirtiest fuel in the world. And it's not surprising why. Most of it is burned out at sea. It's far away from people. And so you don't see it, out of sight, out of mind. So the bunker fuel used in ships, very, very dirty, very, very polluting. And so the shipping industry has been one of the last to really green. But it's on, there's some really encouraging, developments on that front. Another key point here, though, is in the US, a lot of air pollution in our major cities comes from ports. So we've actually done a pretty good job of cleaning up the cars and trucks and buses. But the ports actually, because that bunker fuel is so dirty and they're idling a lot outside of the ports or sitting in the ports and idling, it actually generates most of the air pollution in some of our major cities. So if you want environmental justice, you really have to attack the ports and green them and get the zero emissions vehicles in there, because oftentimes it's very low income and minority communities that are living adjacent to the port. So we really see the greening of the ports both as a climate change mitigation strategy, but really a strong environmental justice strategy. In addition to ports, as I mentioned, we want to green the shipping industry. And, on the left here, you can see this really dark black, fumes coming out of the ship here. That's that bunker fuel that's being burned. And on the right here, we have a little, kind of overview of the cruise ship of the future, not necessarily the container ship, but the technology is similar. So we're talking about, new fuel cells. There's hydrogen fuel cell technology. I was also talking with an organization yesterday that's developing actually a solar ship. And so the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, is moving in that direction. They're creating standards for low emission ships. They have a goal of a reduction in greenhouse gases by 2050 of 50%. So those of you who work in the climate space might know that most people are calling for full decarbonization of the global economy by 2050. So that 50% is a great step, but it's not quite enough. We really need to accelerate this. And again, because most ships are out of sight, out of mind, and a lot of this fuel is burned at sea, we really are going to need R&D and some pretty big government incentives to get this large, crucial industry to accelerate its greenhouse gas reduction targets. This is something that the market is unlikely to do on its own. And so we're calling for some good R&D in there. And I can talk about some bills in Congress that are making their way through, that have not been passed into law yet, but that are making their way through. All right, so sustainable seafood. The key point I want to make here is that sustainable seafood, in our view, does not mean sustainable fishing. Much of the environmental NGO community has been focused on sustainable fishing for decades. And it's, everywhere from Monterrey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch Program, where I'm based here, to, the Marine Stewardship Council, to Fishwise, to all these kind of rating systems. And that's great. I think they're doing a lot of good work, but it's kind of old term thinking. Sustainable seafood is much more than just, limiting fisheries damages and limiting, overfishing in certain areas of the world. And so I want to outline a couple areas of the new blue economy that we really see as promising to help take pressure off the oceans and help coastal communities adapt. So I have three pictures here. The first is finless fish. I'll talk about that in a second. The one on the right there is Akua Kelp, and then below is ocean hugger. So that finless fish is fish that has been developed through cell-based technology. And so this is actually grown in a vat in a kind of brewery-like system. So like you probably have heard of people growing clean meat. So, pork and beef grown without animals. They take cells from an animal line and then they grow it in a brewery-like condition. They're doing the same with fish. And so this is actually crab cakes made with this technology. And this is going to be a big, big part of the way to not only get us off wild fish, but also just get us off of slaughterhouses and the industrial animal system, which is a real key part of the unsustainability of the modern economy. Akua Kelp on the right here, we really think there's a huge opportunity in the United States for sea vegetable aquaculture. We are way, way behind the rest of the world, and people are starting to discover not only does kelp grow often a foot a day, that cleans the water, it's incredibly nutritious, but they're finding that you can make really cool products out of it. In fact, ones that have meat-like textures. And so that Akua Kelp is a new startup that they make this kind of kelp jerky. And it's quite good. I actually bought it. And there's a lot of new products coming out that are kind of in this vein. Below there is the Ocean Hugger. It's a company that makes plant-based seafood. And so what you see there is their tuna. It's called I think it's I'm actually forgetting their exact name, but it's their tuna. It's made out of actually tomato. It's a tomato with some kelp oils and some seasoning, and it's created in a way that it actually tastes very similar to tuna. And they have one for eel too. So the point, what I'm saying here is that sustainable seafood doesn't just mean, getting fishermen and women to be a little bit better in their practices. We have new technologies that are going to be a big part of kind of the blue economy portfolio, both in sea vegetable aquaculture, mussels, oysters, and the shellfish, then the plant-based versions, and then also the cell-based technology, which is, not economic at this point, still quite expensive, but a lot of venture capital money is coming into it. And we see this as a huge industry. The last point I'll just make about this real quickly is that since a lot of this stuff can be produced in, brewery-like conditions, we could do this in the industrial heartland of the United States. We could have a finless fish factory in Detroit or in Appalachia, right? We could put this in parts of the world that have been, in parts of the country that have been deindustrialized. So these are where we have a really educated workforce, a very strong, workforce that used to be in kind of more manufacturing, and they would be perfect for this type of work. And the real estate's cheap, and then we could take pressure off of, wild fisheries. So I think I'm really excited about this technology. Moving on here, coastal restoration. So this is our climate adaptation piece, right? So all across, we have thousands of miles of coastline in the United States, and we're gonna have to protect this from climate change, from sea level rise, from storm surge. The beauty is that instead of putting seawalls, if we actually use living shorelines and create this new coastal restoration industry, which these photos are pictures of, this will be a huge job producer and also help to restore the ecology of some of our most prized coastal habitats. So I just think this is incredibly exciting stuff. And as you can see, some of it is like hybrid technology, like that picture on the right. You have some concrete rock structures, and then you have this reef with all the oyster shells here. So a lot of these are hybrid systems. So not 100% living nature-based systems, but these hybrid systems are actually stronger. They're much better for the environment, and they last longer, and they're more economic. This is another part that's really key to emphasize. This stuff is actually cheaper than the seawalls in most places. So we can talk about in the Q&A if you want how we're going to try to accelerate their adoption. So what will it take to make all of this happen? We got political reform. We need policy changes. We need a lot of financing because a lot of this money is not going to come from the public sector. Of course, that means we need entrepreneurs, as mentioned in the Finless fish and the Akua Kelp. These are all startups. None of this is coming from government. This is, young entrepreneurs. And then we're going to need a new workforce, and especially for that coastal restoration industry, that's going to, in my estimation, employ probably hundreds of thousands of people within the next couple of decades. So I want to report some exciting news that's just from yesterday. So on October 20th, which is, yesterday, Tuesday afternoon, the U.S. House of Representatives introduced the Ocean Climate Solutions Act. And so while this bill is not comprehensive to everything I just outlined, it includes a large chunk of it. And it is the most comprehensive ocean climate bill ever introduced, I think, in the world, but absolutely in the United States. Now, the House is not going to vote on this anytime soon. As you might know, there's an election coming up, and typically when elections are coming up, people don't vote on big bills, but they're starting hearings. And they just had a press release yesterday and a nice short introduction where the chair of the committee, the House Natural Resources Committee, introduced the bill along with some of the usual suspects in the marine conservation community. This is a huge deal. We're now working on a companion Senate bill, and we're hoping that if the election goes in the direction of people who actually care about the environment, that this bill might come up for a vote, in Congress next summer is kind of what we're hoping, is by next summer. So this means, within less than a year, we could have really strong ocean climate legislation that does a lot of the things I just outlined in a really big way. So again, the next steps here, I just outlined a couple of them. A couple other things is we need some companion bills here because there's not insurance reform, and shipping didn't make it into this bill because that's in a different committee. But there's a really amazing congresswoman out here in California, in LA, who's introduced a bill to create $1 billion of grants a year to help create zero emissions vehicle proliferation in the US ports. We're working with her. We're going to try to get her to beef that up, even provide more money. The FEMA insurance reform is a really tricky subject. We can get into that in the Q&A, but that's also crucial, right? We can't keep subsidizing people in flood zones and keep rebuilding things that get devastated every 5 years. It's a waste of money. It's dangerous. It's not good for the environment. So those are the shipping and the FEMA reform are two things that aren't in this Ocean Climate Solutions Act. The final part here is that my group, the Center for the Blue Economy, along with Blue Frontier, we're building a national coalition now. I'll send a change.org petition that that's national, that we're having people sign to get this stuff into law, and hopefully Tony and Randy can send it around to you all so you can share it on your social media and sign it. And then, to get these bills signed into law and then implemented. It's important to note that once the paper, the ink is dry, there's still the implementation process. And when you have, billions of dollars of investment and hundreds of regulations and new incentives, that implementation period is going to be very crucial too, to make sure it works. So that's kind of the overview of how we get the new blue economy built in the 21st century. And I'm happy to report that, real progress is being made. And I hope that you all can help us do this, because again, the key now is building a national coalition and pressuring our elected officials to pass this stuff into law. So my email is here. I'm happy to field questions from you, at a later date, but let's get some Q&A right now as well.
Thanks, Jason. That was super informative, really comprehensive, and some really exciting cutting-edge developments that you've outlined for us. The chat has already been nicely stocked with some questions that are ready to go. One thing that I wanted to start with is the this Ocean Climate Solutions Act, which is, as I completely agree, a huge deal. In many ways, I think there's something about the proposing action on climate through something that connects to the oceans might actually have more of a chance. There's some kind of mindset in our country that reducing emissions from traditional sources is the wrong way to go about addressing climate change, because it's going to kill the economy, which is all false rhetoric, but it's been out there for 3 decades. So I'm really optimistic about how an ocean-based approach to making big climate mitigation strides and strides towards sustainability might have some hope. Do you feel that way? I mean, because I'm also a skeptic in that, here it's been 30 years that the U.S. has not even become a member of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. So is there real reason for hope here?
Yeah. Well, again, I'm very much a pragmatist, and here, all that matters is the votes, right? So we can have all the bills we want. All that matters is the votes. A lot of this, let's be honest, is going to depend who's elected in 2 weeks. And, I'm not telling anyone who to vote for, but if you care about the environment, you should figure out who you should vote for that cares about the environment. So those people win. I actually do think this has a very high likelihood of success. And the reason is, as you mentioned, the oceans are much more bipartisan than other elements of the environmental movement. I think the reason of this, some of it is just simple geography. There's plenty of states run by Republicans that are in the coast, which is, the Carolinas, Florida, Louisiana. So a huge part of the United States is controlled by Republicans that relies on the coastal industries. They don't want oil spills. They have a big tourist economy. They would love clean wind energy. So I think there's just a natural kind of bipartisan coalition that's been formed. We've been talking to a number of Republicans. We've invited them to sponsor the Ocean Climate Action Plan. So I do think that, and then the second point is, look, we're going to be in an interesting moment here. Biden, if he wins, is going to be coming in with a super depressed economy and a need for a huge stimulus deal. And I think what the Democrats have figured out is we can merge stimulus with clean energy investments, blue economy investments, Green New Deal investments. So I think that confluence and that convergence gives us a great degree of confidence we can do this. But like I said, all of you all, we're going to need your help to make sure this happens.
We had a question in the chat that I'm also interested in, and I've heard a lot about this in the context of offshore wind. That ultimately there's challenges involving disrupting shark navigation and destroying reefs and surrounding habitats with the transmission of offshore wind. Can you speak to that?
Yes. So a couple quick things on that. First of all, I just want to start with a macro point. There is no zero impact technology, right? So we have to just deal with the fact that if we want to have a modern economy with 10 billion people and we drive cars and fly around and have computers and et cetera and watch our Netflix, we need to generate a lot of energy, and none of it's zero impact. So that being said, offshore wind can be done in a very, very environmentally friendly way. The new turbines are huge, and a lot of them are floating, so they don't have all the infrastructure going all the way down to the ocean bottom. And there's plenty of places that the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, BOEM, has identified that do not interfere with either navigation, with cetacean life, or with any crucial essential marine fish habitat. So there's still going to be fights over it, but look how large our coastline is. I mean, we're blessed in this country with the Atlantic and Pacific coastline, thousands of, square miles. And it's not a huge footprint to get the offshore wind turbines that we need. And so there absolutely are some places we should not put them. But what we're pushing for is to identify those good places and then streamline the permitting right away. We can't just fight over every last little inch. We have to, get the best scientists, identify those places, give them the permits, and let them do it. And I think it'll be a much, way better than offshore oil and gas. That is for sure.
Absolutely. I think Tony has some questions for you about carbon neutrality in 2050.
Yeah, I just wonder if you can clarify for folks, a lot of the goals are 2050, the Paris Accord, a lot of other frameworks. There's also a lot of the business community who's come out also with talking about carbon neutrality. So I wonder if you could just clarify a little bit about, what the difference is between decarbonization by 2050 and carbon neutrality. And kind of the follow-up question is there a pathway for the environmental and energy industry to sit down and discuss what the pathway is for decarbonization and carbon neutrality, or is that just how do we have that discussion?
Yeah, I mean, those are really good questions. Well, the first thing is, we're talking about decarbonize. That's our language, right? So we're talking decarbonize. An economy that is not producing any greenhouse gas emissions on net by 2050, right? I mean, that's the key concept here. Now, the carbon neutrality debates versus decarbonization, I haven't been too in the weeds on that. Obviously, these definitions just lead to different goals, and the carbon neutrality is a weaker set of goals. It's understandable why the industry wants to push a weaker set of goals, right? They want less pressure to have to do new technologies, new development. Look, I'll say we have a lot of industry support for our plan. There's the offshore wind industry employs thousands and thousands of people, and we can manufacture the turbines in the United States. That would be a huge new part of the manufacturing industry. It's all manufactured in Europe and Asia right now. We have essentially no offshore wind manufacturing. We're importing it all. So that's a huge potential benefit. The unions, the industry unions, they love renewable energy because renewable energy is employing way more people than oil and gas in many parts of the country. And it will, the coal industry is dying and employs like 50,000 people. That's that's how much people that are hired in solar, in a few months in many parts of, and maybe not right now because of the pandemic. So industry absolutely should have I think much of industry is encouraged by this stuff and is supported. There's obviously some hardcore elements of the fossil fuel industry that are not. They have to be essentially forced to do it. I mean, they cannot have a veto on the sustainability of the planet. We need a political party and a political movement that says, you guys can be part of the solution, transition, but you cannot veto sustainability.
Tom had a question for you about the shipping industry.
Please.
Hi, Jason. Thanks for the talk. Really great stuff. Yeah, so what we've seen is the shipping industry has a desire to move to LNG as a fuel source, but ports around the world actually are installing it, except in the United States. And most of the opposition to that comes from environmental NGOs and nonprofits that fight these facilities locally. So how do we resolve that conflict?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't have a great answer for you. The only thing that I could, the things when I talk to people about this, I think what I get is if the shipping industry was committed, if it was LNG plus a commitment to hydrogen fuel cell, renewable later down. So it was like it was clear that this was a kind of a transition technology, a bridge technology, not a permanent, we're just going to LNG and that's it, we're done. I think you would have more people in the environmental community, open to this. But then again, you have a lot of this at the local level, the opposition. It's not the larger national environmental movement, right? So it's going to be tough, but I think you would have to, some merging of them committing to much more stringent targets 10, 20 years out. That would maybe ease some of the opposition. But again, the local stuff would be the tough part. These are great questions.
And can you share some of the information about MIIS for us? Just kind of a general overview.
Yeah, sure. So we only have a master's program. So we're kind of unique in that way that we are a professional graduate school with only master's degrees. So no undergraduate, no PhDs. And when I say no undergraduate, we have a couple people who are in this kind of BA and MS, little kind of hybrid degree, but essentially that's a very small number. So we're essentially a professional master's program. And the program that I chair is the International Environmental Policy Program. It's been around for about 25 years. And it's, we're very strong on ocean coastal resource management. That's obviously what I've been talking to you all today about. But we also do a lot on sustainability management for the corporate sector and kind of supply chain management, and produce kind of people in the chief sustainability officers, those kind of positions. And we do a pretty fair amount in traditional conservation, your terrestrial stuff, your agroforestry, your sustainable agriculture, et cetera. But the Center for the Blue Economy is a special, element of the program. We got some private money to set up the center, and we're actually going to have our 10-year anniversary in April. And we've been doing really big projects, both internationally and at the national level, and then we do a lot in California. One thing at the national level, that might be of interest to you all, is we just helped the U.S., the NOAA and the Bureau of Economic Analysis create the first ocean economic satellite account. And what that is, it's a kind of a mouthful. We created a detailed economic account for the ocean's contribution to the U.S. economy. So you can now go and look in pretty high level of detail about what the ocean economy looks like in the U.S., how many jobs, what the sectors are. And so this is a pretty big deal. We've been working on this for about 10 years. It just came out, the prototype this year. So we're, working with the U.S. government to create ocean economic accounting systems. And we're doing this also with other countries around the world. Our students are doing great in the job market. They're crushing it, both at kind of traditional NGOs, Conservation International, Environmental Defense Fund, but also they're getting into consulting, private business. They're going to work for the UN Food and Agriculture Organization in Rome, World Bank. So we have a pretty eclectic mix, but they're all being very, very successul. And so if any of you want more information on that, please just follow up with me, and I can kind of put you in touch with some current students or alumni. So if you're thinking about a graduate program, especially in the topics that I just mentioned, I think we could be a good fit for you.
Yeah, I'd be interested to see the data on how many of your grads see that degree as a stepping stone into environmental law and policy career. That's
a good question. I think definitely the policy very strong. The law, we do have a couple courses in environmental law. Since obviously it's not equivalent at all to a law degree, I don't think there's a lot that focus on them, but they definitely, particularly in environmental consulting, we have a couple people in negotiations who work on kind of international negotiations, and those more kind of emphasize the law angle.
Trying to think if there was something else from the chat that we didn't get to yet. Someone else can chime in if they have something.
Yeah, I get it. It's lunch hour at your time and it's Zoom fatigue. So, I appreciate you all who came out.
I had a question about tidal versus wave energy, but someone who was on the call and left answered that for me, because I was always thinking they were synonymous.
Okay.
Yeah, so there was a question that I had about sustainable seafood and trying to see if there's a parallel with lab-grown meat, because you've got this emerging technology that's obviously very good for the environment compared to traditional harvesting practices for our food sources. On the lab-grown meat side, there's pushback from animal activists because it still involves harvesting of animal cells. It's not as good as plant-based meat from an animal rights perspective. And there's also the problem that the facilities that would create plant-based meat or lab-grown meat are very energy intensive. So that's not good for climate change. So what sources of pushback are you aware of on the sustainable seafood?
Well, I would say that I first say all the critiques you just mentioned are exactly the same for sustainable seafood. It's the same technology, it's just different cell lines, right? So it's the exact same, but I would push back on that. I would first say that, you know, on the animal welfare side, look, I wish everybody, I've been vegan 30 years. I have an amazing diet. Nobody on this planet eats better than me. If only people saw how great it was, they would all switch over immediately. But you know, people, it's not going to happen in any time frame that matters. And so replacing meat with identical meat is the way to really get off the industrial agricultural system and the overfishing. If we can grow tuna in a brewery, then we can save the tuna species. So I just think if you're really looking at conservation, you really need, you know, the fact that they harvest a few cells from a tuna and then they can produce millions of tuna, it's just, you got to put things in perspective. It's not pure in the sense that the plant-based stuff, but it's as close to pure as you're going to get. And once the cell lines are established, you don't need to harvest them anymore, right? They're permanently. So that's part one. And then in terms of the energy, there's no question that is true that cell-based meat is more energy intensive than the plant-based. So, you know, Beyond Burger is going to be less energy than a cell-based meat burger. But still, compared to actual meat or actual fishing, remember with fishing, I mean, these huge fleets got to go out and then they got to refrigerate this stuff and freeze it. I mean, the energy in transporting fish around the world is incredible. So if you could just grow it in a lab and then send it the last 100 miles or 500 miles instead of halfway around the world, this is going to be still relatively much less energy intensive. And then if the energy is coming from wind and solar, who cares, right? It's carbon-free energy anyway, right? So I think, you know, I'm really sympathetic to the animal rights movement, but I think, again, this comes back to my point earlier, there's no zero impact technologies. And if we're looking for purity, it's a fool's errand. And we got to be realistic. And that's my answer to that.
Yeah, I'm with you there.
Let me ask you a question just a little bit. You didn't really talk about offshore fish aquaculture. That's been something that the U.S. makes noises about trying to get into. It is much bigger internationally by far. U.S. for a lot of regions hasn't gotten into that. Where do you see aquaculture, fish farming, or not near shore or coastal, but where do you see in terms of ocean aquaculture and prospects?
Yeah. Well, there's two, I'll answer in two ways. The first is what we want to see and what we might see. So what we want to see is essentially none of it. We do not think large offshore fin fish aquaculture meets any definition of sustainability. There's the disease vectors. There's the fact that they're feeding wild fish or other meat products to these fin fish. The only type of large fin fish aquaculture that would be sustainable is if it was herbivorous fish. And this is not the stuff that's being talked about. And so in general, we're really not promoting that. We're promoting a much more near-shore, plant-based, shellfish-based aquaculture system. That being said, there are some permits right now that NOAA is considering for some large fin fish operations, and those very well might go forward, but we just don't see that as a true element of the blue economy.
So I have a question about the Living Shorelines recommendation. Do you view that as a way to restore and stabilize the natural environment? Why we do things like move people away from the hazard, or is this also a way to protect communities that are exposed to these hazards?
Yeah, we think of it as both, right? We think, you know, this it can offer really, you know, economic protection to a lot of infrastructure and a lot of residential and commercial real estate. But at the same time, it can then restore coastal ecosystems that we've really degraded. So that's why we're really bullish on this technology, because it has both benefits. And then it gets the added benefit of, you know, a huge workforce. Just think about the people that need to be involved in this. You need everything from the people growing all the plants and the shellfish to then, you know, produce the material. You need PhD ecologists, marine biologists, chemists, engineers, and then you need this huge workforce. And, there's a lot of people in the United States who only get a high school degree. They don't go on to college or maybe a year of community college. They often used to go work in a plant, in a Ford plant or, a manufacturing plant. Wouldn't it be a lot better to go work outside and building reefs on the coasts of the Carolinas or Florida or, the Pacific Northwest? I mean, that would be an amazing job. And then you need the maintenance, right? You need every 6 months, a year, just go see what's going on there. You need scientific monitoring. So I just think this would be a really across the board, full spectrum employment benefit that rests on both infrastructure protection and ecological restoration.
Yeah, just to follow on with that thought, one of the challenges we see is we really don't have the ability to define the protective benefits of these restored systems or hybrid systems yet, which is kind of limiting its more wider spread use at this point.
Yeah, so it's really funny you say that, because our main recommendations on this is not the economics as much, but on the engineering standards, the demonstration projects, on the kind of proliferation of the information is the key roadblock right now. Because we know there's a lot of projects that are economic and that have the restoration benefits, but people don't know about them. There's no clear specs, there's no databases. Whereas, seawalls, we have 50 years of building them. We have thousands of them around the world, and people know exactly the cost and what they're getting. We don't have the equivalent for the living shorelines industry. So we're really pushing the Army Corps of Engineers to create new engineering standards. We want to create a network of demonstration projects around the country. And, Nature Conservancy is starting a little list because the neighbors see someone doing it, and then the storm hits and that neighbor's one is protected and theirs got destroyed. And you start saying, hey, what were you doing? And then you get this kind of contagion, kind of network effects. And so we really think the information sharing and standardization is the key to the proliferation and adoption.
Yeah, I think that's catching on. I heard last week at a conference that the American Society of Civil Engineers has formed a committee to start to look at standards for living shoreline elements.
Absolutely.
So
That's
it's
great.
moving in that direction.
Oh, that's great. I should look into that. So
I'll send you a contact if you want.
Oh, that'd be awesome. That'd be awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, we're thinking alike on that, the role of COVID in helping our agenda. I just wrote an article that's proposing the phasing out of fossil fuels and industrial animal ag as kind of common enemies that are propelling the climate crisis and being facilitated by the federal government's subsidies and regulatory gaps. And it was just remarkable researching the effect of COVID and how it has propelled that transition like no other wishful thinking could have. How BP and Sunoco are voluntarily shifting their portfolios now because they took multi-billion-dollar hits in losses from COVID's effects on the demand for oil. So yeah, we'll take it, and hopefully we'll capitalize on it to the maximum extent we can.
Yeah, I agree. It is, again, we got to get the silver linings where we can in these dark times, and so I'll take it as well. I'd love to see that paper, by the way. If you can send me a link to that, I'd love to see that.
I will do that. Well, we're just about out of time. Any closing thoughts from anybody?
Actually, I have a quick question because I also have to leave at 1 because I have a class. But hi, my name is Jasmine Barzin, and I just have a quick question because you said something about that we import a lot of our parts for the engineering projects from around the world, and we don't really do a whole lot nationally. What is kind of like and I know you also said how there's no such thing as zero impact technology, but what is your kind of opinion or thought process on how can we kind of expand our clean energy to the rest of the world? Because obviously, like, we're trying to clean up our energy and how we produce things, but how can we kind of like expand that idea to other parts of the world? Because I know other parts don't have it as easy, or they are kind of like going about making our parts for our projects in not an environmentally or like in a non-environmentally kind of like beneficial way. So
Yeah. Sure. Well, thanks, Jasmine. So a couple quick things. Yeah, so I was specifically stating when we don't manufacture wind turbines, but the reality is we don't really manufacture solar panels either. Now, interestingly, the solar panels are really cheap because of China. Chinese government's been subsidizing those to the tune of tens of billions. And at this point, they're so cheap that it's probably better to just import them from China. You know, China wanted to subsidize them and crash the world price. We should send a thank you card to China because now we can all get cheap solar panels. The offshore wind turbines, though, however, there's still a lot of technological development to go in with this, and they're really huge and expensive to transport, unlike solar panels. These things need super tankers and everything, so there's probably a good economic case that we should build those in the United States. And the reason we haven't is because there's been such a backlog of offshore wind projects. We have almost no offshore wind in the entire United States. I didn't start with that, but that's just an amazing thing. We have thousands of miles of coastline. We're the biggest economy in the world, and we have one tiny little minuscule wind project off Block Island, where other people have multiple gigawatts on, in relatively small economies. So once the manufacturing industry sees these projects getting green lighted and they go, wait up, we're going to have 20, 30 gigawatts produced in America over the next 10 years. We should build that here. So I think that is coming. To your larger point, I think, remember what America does really well is we also do the kind of the technology side, right? We do the innovation side. And that's, by the way, where a lot of the money is. And so I think the good example is on the cell-based meat. Really, America's leading the world on that. So if we can get cell-based seafood and then get this to be where it's economic, we can export that technology all over the world. And then we can have, manufacturing facilities in Asia, Latin America, Africa, producing salmon and tuna and taking huge pressure off of these wild fisheries, especially in the areas where they don't have the resources to really patrol the waters and control their exclusive economic zones and protect their coastal resources. So I think America doesn't need to produce everything. We need to be strategic, but I think wind is one. And I think the technology for coastal restoration, another one. If we create those standards and we become a real leader in coastal restoration technology, that could be a great thing to export around the world as well.
Really fantastic information, Jason, and it looks like we've reached our time here, and just want to thank you again for taking the time with us. I've learned a whole lot, and I'm pretty invested in these issues, and it was also very inspiring to hear a lot of your views on these, and that sense of hope that we're moving in the right direction and have some opportunities to make an impact on these issues, which is always nice in these dark times. So.
Yeah. Well, thank you all so much. It was great to talk with you all. And I miss the East Coast. I'm looking forward to getting back there.
Hopefully sometime soon.
Yeah. All right. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, Jason. Bye.
Thanks,
Bye. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.